Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isfron, and with me today is Deputy Administrator Rich Serino, who also happens to be one of our first Executive Leaders Program graduates. Welcome, Rich.
Good to be here. It's always great to come back here to Monterey.
Well, there's so much going on at FEMA, and we rarely get a chance to talk to you this way. So what's going on in the entire landscape around the country?
Oh, entire landscape around the country, not much.
Nothing, not a big leading question or anything.
No, I think one of the things that, over the last, few years, we've actually tried to incorporate what we call whole of community. And people have heard that and say, what does that really mean? And it really means bringing together people who literally didn't have a seat at the table before, whether it's, federal, state, local, and tribal governments, and bringing them together. And what does that really mean? That, if you think of all the assets that group brings together, the federal government, from Department of Defense to HHS to Homeland Security, all the federal agencies, HUD, has a lot of resources. And then you add the state resources. And then really at the local level, where the rubber meets the road, where the work is done,
Right.
Of tremendous resources. And you bring those all together, and you actually have a very, very strong team. But is it really the whole team? Mm-hmm. Not at all. If you look and you say, now we have to look at who else is part of that team. And it's really reaching out to the private sector. And people say, well, what's the private sector? Private sector is huge. Typically we talk to the Walmarts, the Targets, we talk to the box stores, the Home Depots, the Lowe's. But really, let's go past that. Let's look at not just the critical infrastructure, but look at the financial institutions. Let's look at some new businesses. Let's look at how to give people literally a seat at the table. And we were able to, a few years ago, have people representing the private sector in the National Response Coordination Center, the NRCC in Washington. But we also were able to develop, shortly after that, the NBEOC, the National Business Emergency Operations Center, a virtual EOC that we literally have hundreds of members now that can join that and share ideas, but also solve problems in real time during disasters, and having those as part of the team. And then bringing together the nonprofits, bringing together the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and literally giving people a seat at the table, literally bringing people in and working the issues ahead of time. In the faith-based community, the wonderful work that they do, and there's literally hundreds of organizations, and one would be the Southern Baptist that has kitchens that they can go out and feed 50,000 people during a disaster. And they do it very well. They have registered dietitians, they bring people out, and giving them a seat at the table, and let's talk with them ahead of time. Common sense things that perhaps we always haven't done, but giving all those people a seat at the table, and then really incorporating the biggest part of the team, and that is the public, to make it okay for people to help their neighbors. In fact, there was a poll out recently that was done, and it showed that 57% of people would go to their neighbors first for help, and only 14% would go to FEMA. And some people were all concerned. And to me, that's great. Actually, I think the 57% should be higher, is because it's really about neighbors helping neighbor. And then government kept stepping in after the fact, but it's really bringing in the whole community, because it's not just government. FEMA is actually just this much of what we do. Is part of the team. It's really everybody else. So it's really important that whole community comes together. And that actually turns into what we call, now we've developed the administrator's intent. And there were 2 imperatives and 5 priorities. And the first imperative is actually the whole community.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those in the intent, because I think that's really important for people to understand, and we'll have that available for folks if that's okay.
Right. No, that's perfect.
Great. So you have a public-private sector office at FEMA, and in the past it's just not FEMA, but government in general says it's easier to say no than say yes. Can you give examples of where now that's changed and when you've evolved to more of a yes?
Well, I think one of the important things is our chief counsel is a person that says, how do we get to yes? In fact, we have many lawyers, and the only one that can really say no is the chief counsel. It's building that culture to find a way to get to yes. Not illegally, don't want to break any laws, right. But there's usually a way to get to yes. And we have private sector for years. We didn't have anybody at the NRCC, and now we have somebody every 3 months that rotates through. Because the private sector is a very big part of the whole community. And during disasters, people who are going to help rebuild the community is not going to be government. It's going to be the private sector working with the nonprofits and working with the citizens is to help rebuild the economy, to get the economy back up and running. Because that's one of the keys to how a community rebuilds. It's never going to be government just alone. It has to be government helping a little bit, but the private sector in getting people back to work and getting jobs. One of the ways is through the NDRF, the National Disaster Recovery Framework, and that's a way that people can actually develop plans for recovery. We have a lot of plans for response, but what we want to do is have people work for recovery, and one of the key parts of that is not just the government agencies, but working with the private sector in your community as well. So for people to take the opportunity to reach out to their private sector partners in the community ahead
And
of
build
time.
those relationships.
And build the relationships ahead of time. That's going to be absolutely key because it's not just during the response. The recovery is the long part, the expensive part, and sometimes the hard part. But having, the private sector involved ahead of time and actually having them, because that's where people go to work, that's where the economy generates, and that's how people get back together and get their feet underneath.
And that's what I really see that's different at FEMA and under your leadership about changing culture and relationships and making a difference through those, because that's how change happens, really,
Right.
with those connections.
And I think part of it is building those relationships, but always having the focus. And our focus is survivor-centric, and to be focused on how we can do better for the survivor. And that's very conscious, not calling somebody a victim.
Right.
Is calling somebody a survivor. And we changed that lexicon a while ago. Victims, unfortunately, are people who have died or passed away during disaster, but everybody else is a survivor. And just changing that word
That's huge.
makes a big difference, because if you call somebody a victim, you have a different way to respond. Whereas if you're a survivor, that gives you usually some strength to move on. And so we become a survivor-centric organization, and everything that we do is focused around the survivor, whether it's an individual or the community that survived, and to help them get back to where they need to be.
And that's part of the administrator's intent. So let's walk through that and tell me all about it.
Sure. I think one of the things is there's two key imperatives of how we look at the overall agency, and one is, as I mentioned earlier, the whole community, and the next is how do we learn and innovate as a community, and really how can we take in what we're doing is educating and learning as well, not just training, but learning what we're able to do and how we're able to do it, but looking for opportunities to innovate, because with new technologies, with new ideas that people have, with different budget cuts, we have to change.
Right.
Who would have thought, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that everybody walking around with a little computer in their hand that you don't use as a phone. Very few people call on that anymore, but it's a computer in your hand, and we're able to communicate with people, and they can communicate with us. It's not just a one-way communication. How do we take that? And so we have to really adapt and move forward. And 5 years ago, who would have known? If I could predict 5 years from now, that would be great. But we have to continue to learn and innovate. And that's the two imperatives. But then it goes into what the 5 priorities are. And the first priority is actually becoming a survivor-centric organization, and how we're able to focus everything that we do is survivor-centric. And the next is FEMA is to become an expeditionary organization. And everybody's like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Of course we're an expeditionary organization. And that's, certain people are, but really making the whole agency understand that our job is not necessarily to sit behind a desk in Washington. Some people it is, but even those people, we try to get them out. And we put a large percentage, greater than 50% of our workforce went out during Hurricane Sandy to be deployed. So I think that that's actually a really key part of how we're able to get FEMA as an expeditionary organization. And then the third one is to build capacity for catastrophic disaster, to really posture ourselves for catastrophic disaster and how we can be ready and have the doctrine ready to go for that, how to practice to that, to respond to, if we will, the maximum of maximums, and how we're able to actually be there and have not just FEMA, but government, the whole community, all working together to really deal with a catastrophic incident. I think that's actually one of the key parts. And then how do we, really look at how we can look at reducing risk nationally? How do we actually look at doing that is the fourth imperative. And whether they're looking at our mitigation strategies, how we can recover better after an incident. And a lot of that is how we build, how we rebuild, where we build initially, but also what else we can do to help that along. So I think really how can we reduce our risk is one of our imperatives. And the last is mainly an internal one, is how we can achieve business excellence. How we can do things better internally to decrease, if we call, the hassle factor to our employees, but also how we can provide business better, whether it's how we deliver commodities. Can we reach out with some of our private sector partners that do it every day, dare I say better than we ever will? And how do we come, really business excellence? So I think that's one of the key parts, is how we're able to do that. So it's pretty simple. We haven't changed much, but it's having the two imperatives of whole of community and learn and innovative community, and then the 5 priorities.
So would you say the mission hasn't changed, but the way that it's being performed is more current, and it's just building and growing? And
I think it's building and growing, and as we look at how we're going to prioritize things going forward, we look at the administrator's intent, and that's what we used as a guidepost, if you will, moving forward.
And you almost have to kind of keep it simple so people can really
You have to
get
keep it
behind
simple, especially for people like me.
Well, you've been in this a while, so you've done a lot of, you've been a public safety official for 32 years?
Now it's about 40, counting 4 years at
Goodness.
FEMA.
Yeah,
36 in Boston, and now 4+ at FEMA.
you're a true Bostonian.
I am. Go Red Sox.
All
Red
right.
Sox just won the World Series, in case you didn't know.
I had no idea. So tell me what you're looking forward to, in terms of what FEMA is doing that still excites you about emergency management. I mean, you've seen it. You've been all over the country. You've seen everything.
Every day is truly exciting, and I think we're looking at new challenges. It's not a secret that budgets are tough, but how can we do that more effectively? How can we continue to make education? How do we continue to make training? How do we continue to make learning is a priority? And that is a priority for us, for all of our folks with internal FEMA, but externally as well, because we have to look at how that's an important part of what we do, because we're going to be asking people to do some very difficult things and work in very trying times. It's what we do. But we have to give people the tools to do that. And one of the best ways to do that is through training and education.
That critical thinking skill set can apply anywhere, anytime.
Right, because I think one of the things that we realize that decisions aren't going to be made in the crucial moments in Washington. They're going to be made on the ground, and they're going to be made with people who were there. And over the last number of years, we've pushed a lot of the authority, a lot of the responsibilities down for us to the regional administrators, and then because our job is to support the governors, support the citizens at the local level.
Well, you're doing a great job, and we really appreciate your stewardship and your leadership there at FEMA.
Well, thank you. It's really a team, and that's one of the key parts is we need all the members of the team. I feel fortunate we have a great team of folks at FEMA, a great team of folks in the whole community, and it's all about the survivor.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you.